But me first spend the first few minutes with the president, maybe more on the political side, President Osmani. I think you've just returned from UNGA, from the United Nations session, and of course there are lots of conflicts in the world. As I was saying this morning, even recently, some bad news has been arriving in the Middle East, but there's the other big conflict is with Ukraine, and Kosovo, of course, is very much in the middle of all of that. So the world is in a very difficult situation, sort of being a leader of an important country geopolitically in Europe. How do you see the world going?
Well, again, thank you so much for including me, and I really look forward to listening from each of the panelists and learning from your experience as politicians. It's one of my favorite times when we are in the same panel with CEOs and global companies so that we can really get that perspective and learn a lot as politicians. Kosovo is a small country, but with an important story to tell. It's a story of resilient people that have build a country on the very foundations of democracy, rule of law, human rights, and the fundamentals of freedom. And of course, having been colonized and under occupation for more than a century, we never take our freedoms for granted because too much sacrifice have been made for the democracy, the freedom, the independence that we enjoy today. But at the same time, the story of Kosovo tells us all what democracies can achieve when we get together, based on those very same principles and values. And it's a success story that makes proud not only its people, but also our partners globally, because it's one of the most important investments in peace. For the very first time in the history of the Western Balkans, we are living in peace. That region was shaped by conflicts for centuries and centuries. For the very first time, we have a little bit more than 2 decades that our children are living in peace. So every generation had to go through a war, and our children are the very first generation in the history of our nation that are growing up in peace. And that's an enormous achievement.
Isn't the peace being threatened?
I do believe so, and I was getting at that. When the war in Kosovo ended, we thought that when we all said never again, that we would learn those lessons from history. But unfortunately, even now, in 2024, there's war in the middle of Europe, a war that is threatening all of us, not just the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the freedom of Ukraine. And I believe that the war in Ukraine, the unjust and unprovoked war that Russia waged against Ukraine, is a litmus test for democracies way beyond Europe. And we need to make sure that the principles that are set and the help that we all provide to Ukraine for winning are enough for Ukraine to really win this war for all of us. Because if it doesn't happen that way, it's unfortunately an encouragement, and it will embolden autocrats, not just the autocrat in Russia, but autocrats all around the globe, to act against smaller states who might have a less amount of weapons with absolute disregard of the principles of international law and the rules-based order. And very, very dangerous times will come for all of us if these principles are not upheld in the case of Ukraine. We already see that Putin is very much interested to have a spillover effect of Ukraine. There are constant efforts to destabilize the Western Balkans. And it is so crucial that the Western world does not lose its attention of the Western Balkans, because things can really get out of hand quickly. And of course, when there's lack of safety and stability, there's also lack of investment. There's lack of economic development and prosperity. So practically lack of national security, and when that security is threatened, has a spillover effect on every area of life, from economic development to trade relations with other countries. and to just the betterment of life of all of our citizens, not just in Kosovo, but also the rest of the region. So we think it's so fundamental that these basic principles of international law, but also the very values that stand at the foundations of our value-based system, which are the European Union, NATO, and other organizations that we seek to become a member of, should be protected at all costs. Because by protecting these values, we also ensure economic development, prosperity, and also trade relations with the wider world, not just with our continent and the continent that we're part of.
So this is, of course, a position which, not of course, but this is a position a lot of people in Western Europe, I think, share. But how do you see sort of the conflict ending? Are we going to defeat Russia, or are we going to deter Russia? How do you, at some point, do we need to go for dialogue and discussions? I guess your point right now was we have to be strong, we have to be resistant, but where is this going to end up? What do you hope this will end up as?
Well, of course, there should be dialogue at some point in time, but my point is there must be a principled dialogue. And not a dialogue where the aggressor is rewarded with territory, because that sets an extremely dangerous precedent for the rest of the world. If Putin is awarded with Ukrainian territory as a result of some sort of a peace process, we can't call that a just peace. That is, in fact, an encouragement for him to continue invading other countries in the neighborhood and at the same time destabilize regions such as the Western Balkans. And that, in turn, achieves not just his imperialistic ambitions about more territory, but also achieves his ambitions about destroying the values-based systems that the EU and NATO as a transatlantic partnership are. Because if the Western Balkans is destabilized, if the eastern flank is destabilized, the entire European continent is destabilized. So we cannot talk about a project of Europe whole, free, and at peace, which is the dream of all of us, if very essential parts of Europe are under constant instability and attacks by Russia and its proxies. So I think it's essential that when the moment comes for that dialogue, that it's a principled dialogue based on the already existing rules-based international order, and not to reward an aggressor with territory, because that is not the ending. That would simply be the beginning of new conflicts in the wider region and would, I think, destroy Europe as we know it.
It was an interesting discussion also earlier on, I'm not going to ask you yet to speak on the role of China in all of that, by the way, because this is a very fundamental issue for Europe and also India, by the way. But we'll have one more question for the President. What did I want? Are you worried about, you don't have to answer that, given you're president of a country, are you worried about the US elections?
Kosovo has been blessed with bipartisan support from the United States, so we're practically perhaps one of the few cases in the world that has always had the US support. So we became free, we were liberated during a Democrat government, we became independent during a Republican government, and we've built our democratic and economic resilience with both Republicans and Democrats. Obviously, they have different approaches, but we've learned how to work with both, and ultimately it's the will of the American people that decides that. We're going to work with whoever is elected, but as I said, of course, it takes quite a different approach depending on who is elected. But Kosovo really counts on that support because the US has played a leadership role in rallying the democratic world behind the people of Kosovo during some of the darkest hours in our history. We will forever be grateful, but of course now we're not the top priority in anybody's desk. It's a lot of conflicts happening around the world, and I'm glad that we're not that kind of priority. Right now, when we talk about Kosovo, we talk about how we can bring in more investments with, being the youngest population in Europe, tech-savvy, multilingual, with so much potential, with free trade agreements, with all around Europe investing in Kosovo. It's not just investing in tiny little Kosovo, but in fact in hundreds of millions of Europeans. So with a lot of that potential, the best tax system, and with with a 100% compliance with EU standards, looks like the best destination for everyone here to invest. So if you would be interested, please come to Kosovo. So we don't have to be, we have no time to be worried, because to be very frank, we're working with a lot of resilience and persistence to make sure that we create partnerships with countries around the world. So we will be working with whoever the people of the United States select.
Excellent. Last question, and then we'll turn to the panel. On the Draghi report, so you just talked about Europe, but talk about the economy, and we'll be talking about that also a little bit more in a second. I asked the same question to the Deputy Prime Minister of Albania an hour ago. The Draghi report was not very positive, or was actually saying that there are quite a few issues in Europe which we need to solve. But you're still obviously interested and want to be part of the European Union. How do you look at this Draghi report? Does that apply also to Kosovo, or does it make you get scared of Europe, actually?
Not at all. I mean, Kosovo has had to meet so many challenges in its path towards the European Union that I don't think anything can scare us any longer. 97% of the people of Kosovo are pro-European Union. Even if we go back hundreds of years before the European Union existed, it was our nation that led Europe into defending what at that time, 600 years ago, was called the European civilization. So these foundations that are, as the cornerstone of the EU, are still very much what lead our people in our vision towards the European Union. Perhaps because of the very painful past that we have had, we're very resilient. And I think what the Draghi report points out is simply an honest picture of the challenges. And I think the Europe, or the European Union that we want, is one that takes up these challenges rather than complaining about them. Oftentimes when we participate in a lot of summits and roundtables or discussions like these, people tend to reject honesty, even if it's, criticism about real challenges that exist in organizations such as the European Union. I think we need to take them as opportunities, because only in that way we can push forward for a European Union that includes the rest of countries that truly believe in these shared values. So I do hope that enlargement is one of the key issues that is taken forward, because we believe that an enlarged Europe is a safe Europe. Europe as a continent will not be, as I said, whole, free and at peace and safe unless the Western Balkans become part of it. So I think we should, not allow our patience to get lost. And despite of the very complex and sometimes very boring and a lot of unfairness that exists in the process and the challenges, as the Draghi report points out, we should never look elsewhere. Our path towards the European Union is our only path, not just as a sort of a vision, but also the real hard work that it requires. And we're very, very determined to stick to it.
Yeah, I think, the fact the Balkans having a perspective of being part of Europe geopolitically is a key issue. And we have Emmanuel Macron here tomorrow. He will talk about Europe. Yes. Let's see what he will say. But I think that's very good. President, how do you see this issue of industrial policy and Kosovo? And you're in a situation where the security issue, as you said, are very important, but developing the economy in Kosovo is also an important issue. How do you see that?
Perhaps just to quickly jump into the issue of what should be the role of the government, I'm a strong believer in the role of private sector as the real engine behind the economic growth of every country. But at the same time, because of everything that was just mentioned earlier, there are certain sectors, depending on the country, obviously, but there are certain sectors that will need the help of the government, the subsidizing from the government. And of course, each country has their own potential, their own industry, their own traditions, and also the way where they can contribute, not just internally, but also to regional and global trade. But there are areas, especially if we're talking about energy security right now, and to connect to the issue of security, Europe has faced in the past couple of years one of the biggest energy crises that we've ever had. And it was created because of security reasons, because the largest part of Europe was also dependent on Russia. And then there are many of us that are not dependent on Russia, but we're dependent on coal. And that means, my country has one of the largest pollutions at the level of Europe, and we need to not leave the private sector alone in fighting that fight. We need to make sure that we aggressively invest in renewables. We need to make sure that we learn a lot from countries that have succeeded in that regard, like the great example that you gave about EVs, electric vehicles. We need then to work with partners such as the United States that has been there for us in making sure that we make that transition through programs such as the MCC and so on and so forth, and also make sure that the European Union steps up. Now, with the new growth plan, there are a lot of, nice words and dreams. We need more tangible results so that we don't let the security challenges get into the way of economic development, as well as moving forward when it comes to energy policy, as well as energy security. So in that sense, we've seen, of course, especially in the last couple of years, crisis after crisis. It started with the pandemic and went on with a big economic inflation crisis, economic crisis, energy crisis, still a lot of these continuing. So I think while the private sector still remains the engine behind the success, there are times when the government really needs to step up. So per capita, Kosovo has been the country with the strongest support to the private sector post-pandemic, and also in getting out of the inflation crisis and so on. And a lot of, schemes that were there to support our citizens. But yet, there still needs to be some government support. And my final point, so that I don't forget to mention this, I need to make sure that I do this everywhere. One of the main instruments that we've used was also the economic empowerment of women, because we had a very high inactivity rate among women, about 80%. And it was horrendous, because if you don't use 50% of your economic potential, which is half of your population, you lose also a lot of money. You lose a lot in terms of economic growth. So a lot of what we did as institutions was to support private companies to employ women through subsidies, and that has led them to more growth. But that has also led the country to more economic growth. So there are areas, of course, depending on what challenge the country is facing, where the government needs to step in, while still letting the private sector, I would say, lead in terms of economic development.
Thank you for making that point about participation in the labor force. The new growth plan, that's the Balkan plan from the EU, which
the new growth plan.
New growth, where they promise
still just on paper.
They promise you support.
Correct.
For reforms in line with EU regulation.
Yes, right? I mean, we are right now at a 100% rate when it comes to alignment with the European Union, both in terms of foreign and defense policy. That doesn't necessarily mean that the EU money goes where the alignment is. Just to give you an example, there are 6 Western Balkan countries right now that are benefiting from these programs. 63% of the EU dedicated money for the Western Balkans goes to, guess which country? The one that is not aligned with the EU, to Serbia. Serbia is about 46% alignment rate.
Why is that?
I wish I had the answer to that question. Maybe when you talk to Macron tomorrow, you can ask that question. And other European leaders, for that matter. So they are only at a 46% alignment with the European Union. Nevertheless, they get more than 60% of the money of the European Union
Maybe you should
dedicated to
align
the Western
less, then you get
Balkans.
more money, maybe.
Well, I don't think we're
Just
going to
a
go in
joke.
that
Yeah,
direction,
yeah,
but I do understand the joke, and a lot of people actually ask that question. Should we align less in order to get more support? But the five of us, the rest of us, Albania, Kosovo, North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, are at a 100% alignment, but all of us together get only 37% of the financial support. So this needs to change. EU money needs to go hand in hand with EU values. That's what we believe.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I think there's a question, looking at the time, and then we don't have much more. There's a question from the students. Yes, please say who you are. And maybe which university. You can step up in front of the microphone, yes, and then also say which university you're from, please.
Okay, thanks for your all sharing. I'm Yu Chen from Beijing Renmin University, and also one of the members from BGD Young Voice. And my question is, I think there are increasingly geopolitical fragmentations because, for example, European unions put high tariff on the EVs, as we all know. And I want to know, like, for example, the countries like Kosovo, could you help me to elaborate on how the country's plans to, for example, to balance the pursuit of economic resilience and through the industrial policy with the need to maintain maybe the open trade relationship and international cooperations in this increasingly geopolitical fragmentations? Thank you.
That's a very good question. Look, when a country within Europe strives to become a member of the European Union, one of the very first things that we do is sign what we call a stabilization and association agreement. It's an agreement that is called stabilization and association, but it's practically a trade agreement. It allows for free trade between our country, that is not a member of the EU yet, and the rest of the European Union. But then it sets so many rules that you have to abide by. So despite of the will that the country might have to have open trade based on the principles that you've mentioned, you have to abide by the rules of the European Union when it comes to economic resilience, when it comes to other trade issues. You have to meet all of those criteria if you want to move ahead. So if you want to move ahead and then open chapters of negotiations and finally become a member, you would have to abide by those rules. You can't set them entirely by yourselves. There are, a few countries that actually have left the European Union, and the reason has been precisely this, mostly this, not entirely trade, but mostly trade, because they did not want to abide by all of these strict rules that the European Union sets when it comes to trade. But just looking at other members that are now in the European Union and how much of an economic resilience they've built by becoming a member from the moment they've become members to date, that's the example that we're seeking. So a lot of rules that you have to abide by, but at the same time, the benefits are enormous. And not just economic, if I might add. It's also about democracy. It's also about rule of law. It's also about other fundamentals that we really trust in and that we believe make us more resilient. So economic resilience is one thing, but for those of us that have lived under really extreme conditions, that were victims of genocide for so many years, it's also about defending freedom. It's also about defending democracy. It's also about defending human rights. So we believe they should go hand in hand, economic resilience and democratic resilience. Mm-hmm.
President, you have the final word. Is that okay?
Sure. No, perhaps just to thank each and every one of you and to thank everyone that is present here and especially you, for giving us the opportunity. As I envisaged at the beginning, I learned a lot from the other panelists.
And you have investment coming now from...
What an honor. I mean, it's India, China, the United States, Germany, and Kosovo. Would have thought in the same table. So, but at the same time, I think it's so crucial that when we sit down with CEOs of businesses, you see how things can be resolved. very practical and very tangible. It should serve as a lessons learned for many politicians around the world. That is in most cases the approach that we need to take to resolving most of the issues. But of course, while productivity and gains are extremely important, what we have learned in our continent is that in many, many cases, trade does not necessarily equal trust. Because if that was the case, we would have never had a Russian invasion of Ukraine. They were each other's main trading partners for decades. So while trade is the cornerstone of so many relations, at the same time, we need to keep an eye on issues of security. We need to keep an eye on basic principles of good faith in terms of neighborly relations first and foremost, but also relations with countries that are quite far away from us. And just like in a contract, it's about gains, but what is the cornerstone of the contracts in many cases is the good faith principle. So I would call for that as well to be the cornerstone of relations between countries if we want to prevent security challenges that are then preventing trade relations. I believe that both India and China want a strong economic partner in Europe, right?
Correct.
Well, that can be achieved only if we're safe and secure. And we will only be safe and secure if Ukraine wins this war. If they do not, it's going to be a complete mess in our continent. And you will not have a good trading partner in Europe. So just not to oversimplify it, but I think it's so important that partners across the world, not just in our continent, give us the support that we need as a continent to first and foremost be safe and secure, for that to open the way for stronger trade relations with the rest of the countries around the world.
I think this is excellent. Thank you, President. And I think we almost have a theme for next year's Berlin Global Dialogue, Carolyn, and building trust or something, because this is also a point which was made this morning, I think, by Larry Fink. I think he said that, and I think trust is very important. And how do we build trust? I think that's important.